Hello, everyone. Welcome to the NT Pod podcast, all about the New Testament and Christian origins. My name's Mark Goodacre, and today I'm in conversation with James Barker, who's Associate Professor at Western Kentucky University. He's written a great new book called Writing and Rewriting the Gospels, and it's published by Eerdmans. And as luck would have it, Eerdmans have also published my new book, The Fourth Synoptic Gospel. And the two of us got together and we had a conversation about each other's books. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Hello, everyone. Warm welcome to the NT Pod, and especially warm welcome to my colleague and friend, James Barker. James Barker is an associate professor at Western Kentucky University, and he's recently written an excellent book called Writing and Rewriting the Gospels, which we're going to be talking about today. And because it's my podcast, we're also going to be talking about this book, The Fourth Synoptic Gospel, which I've written. But we don't do things just in a normal everyday way here on the NT Pod. We like to do things a little differently. So I'm going to talk to James about my book, and he's going to talk to me about his book. No, is that the right way around? I'm going to talk to James about...
You will talk to me. I will ask you about your book.
Yeah. Okay.
And
so
you will ask me.
So let's hope this works. Okay, well, first off, James, tell me about my book. What do you? Well, how did you like it?
I actually loved it. I think that you're right to say that this really is sort of an unintentional trilogy. If you start with the case against Q, and then you go with Thomas and the Synoptics, and now John and the Synoptics, it rounds itself out so nicely, and as one would expect, just from your scholarship. Anyone who knows you or listens to the pod, I joked with our mutual friend Chris Skinner about this, that you can't read your book and not automatically hear it as a book on tape. It's like we have your voice dictating it to us, and so it was just a pleasant read. A compelling read, and as ever, rigorous and meticulous in its scholarship. But I also appreciated something our books, I think, have in common, is an intentional effort not to overburden readers with footnotes. It's not that all that other scholarship doesn't matter. It's not that we're not aware of it or influenced by it. It's just that these are our books, and these are our conclusions, and so as much as possible, let's just have the page full of what we think about this or that.
Yeah, no, thank you, James. And obviously the check's in the mail. But no, it is something which, if I can switch to, if I can hold on a minute, the conceit of this, I'm going to get on top of it. So. Tell me a little bit more. You said that this book is the third part of a trilogy. What's that all about then?
For your book, yes, I think that starting with Case Against Q was just, hey, if you want to know how Matthew, Mark, and Luke are related, we can just relate Matthew, Mark, and Luke without any appeal to a hypothetical Q document. I'm fully on board with that. I was chatting with Francis Watson, whom we both know, at Society of Biblical Literature one year, and he said, I got on a plane in England with Goodacre's book, and when the plane landed, I no longer believed in Q, and so I think that resonates with a lot of us. And I was trained as an undergrad under David Dungan, who was a Griesbachian for biblical studies nerds. They were early Q dissenters, even though their own theory never really held up. They at least held some ground to say, I don't know that we need to be appealing to hypothetical sources, especially when we look at Luke and Matthew and their similarities, ones that we don't find in Mark and ones that we do. So I was sort of predisposed to that view. But the great thing about Dungan is he would always say, don't believe it because I said it. You don't know enough to know. Yeah. You have to study this for yourself. And as a grad student, I came across your work, and that was just so influential to say, okay, this is, I think, a better way to say this is how the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are related, and we should really stop with some of these hypotheticals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were. I mean, the Griesbachians were right, weren't they? That there was something amiss in the standard paradigm, even if they landed on what to both of us was the wrong solution. Because if there's one thing that I think we both firmly believe in, it's mark and priority.
Yes.
So we build very strongly on the priority of Mark, which the Griesbachians rejected. And I think that this has been one of the kind of crown jewels, really, of scholarship, hasn't it, on the New Testament, that Mark and priority just provides such a solid basis for our building our synoptic hypothesis.
Totally agree. But they would also look at those spots where there's a story that's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they would find those so-called minor agreements, a term that you've published on, neither of us care for. They're not minor at all, especially given how numerous they are and how weighty they can be. And so that crew of Griesbachians were pointing things out like that. And I think that was, they still deserve credit for that. But again, that's sort of how I came to your work.
Right,
and then,
right, thanks.
And Thomas, I did one semester of Coptic. I by no means consider myself a Coptic expert, but I was interested in Thomas and how Thomas relates. And it was not long after that your book on Thomas came out, and I said, okay, yeah, literary dependence on Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it actually sets up your latest book, because you mentioned the Infancy Gospel of James, which is something you and I have both written about. But I actually often go to people when they say, John is just so different, or John has so much material that's not coming from Matthew, Mark, and Luke that it needs to be separate. I immediately say half of the Gospel of Thomas has no parallel in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but Mark Goodacre and also Simon Gathercole have argued persuasively, I think to the vast majority of New Testament scholars, that the Gospel of Thomas as we have it has to have used Matthew, Mark, and Luke pretty much in the forms that we have them. And so all of that extra stuff, that's kind of why you write a new gospel, because you've got something else to say. But to get a foothold, you need to sidle up to the stuff that everybody knows or expects. And I think that that's what Thomas is doing, percentage-wise, perhaps to a lesser degree, but not that big of a difference. I think that's what John is doing, and I think you illustrated that exceptionally well.
No, thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. And I should say that when I'm actually not trying to be pretentious when I talk about a trilogy, it's really just a joke. But yes, the books did end up being quite similar. I was more naive when I wrote The Case Against Q, and I was younger and bolder, but and I think now that's been replaced by a devil may care kind of attitude. So we've got that. Now I want to flip the tables and allow you to ask me about your book.
So when you look, and you were very gracious to write such a nice foreword to my book. I appreciate that.
I was delighted to do it.
I think I cite your fatigue in the Synoptics. I think your article on fatigue in the Synoptics and Greg Carey's article on moving things ahead as a Lucan redactional technique, that is just must reading for anybody who's in undergrad, grad school, working on the Gospels. And so I think my favorite section of my book, if I had to just pluck out an excerpt, would be I am Luke's complete lack of surprise.
Yeah.
I love the way, but so much of
you're supposed to be asking me about it.
That's what I wanted to ask. What you make of that? Like, do you buy it? Do you see? Because I see myself as building somewhat on what Greg Carey did. Some of the things he noticed,
Mm-hmm.
I started to say it's not just things that you can find elsewhere. It's things that Luke writes anew and sticks in for a purpose. So does that have an explanatory power to what Luke is doing as a writer?
Now, I'm just going to remind myself and tell the listeners about what we're talking about here. Now, this is things like, let me check. When in Luke 22, Jesus is addressing the disciples, and he says things like, "Look, oh, by the way, in the past we said no bags or sandals, but now, we need to be prepared, and you need swords." And one of the disciples says, "Oh, we've got one here," and Jesus sort of goes, "Enough, right? It's enough." And then in pretty much the next incident, a sword is being used to chop off the ear of the high priest's slave. Is that the kind of thing we're talking about, where Luke
exactly
prepares for? He's like seen some sort of unexplained action, like, where's this sword come from? And he prepares for it by having it in advance. I really love that.
Okay.
And so let me say why. I have read that passage in Luke's gospel so many times, trying to work out what on earth Luke is doing there, because it's even been the basis of some kind of radical treatments of the historical Jesus, where you make Jesus into some kind of zealot, figure. Yes. And then suddenly Luke somehow has this remnant of the zealot Jesus. But I think your explanation makes much better sense, that Luke is simply inferring from the story that he's about to narrate, the one that he actually shares with the others. I think that works pretty well. So give me another example of Luke's lack of surprise.
That one is the main one that I go
your favorite.
to. I ran down a few. It's absolutely my favorite. Yeah. And it's, to me, it's Luke being stuck with a sword fight and needing to at least not literally have the swords come out of nowhere.
Do you know what? When I was a teenager, I did religious education at school, and we studied Luke's gospel, and we used the New English Bible, which is possibly the worst translation that I've ever read. And for that passage, though, it interprets where Jesus says it is enough. It interprets Jesus as saying to the disciples, enough, like as if to say, enough of this nonsense, And so it's a real kind of interpretative paraphrase, that is. And I think it's wrong.
Oh, right. He's the one who just said, get a sword.
Yeah.
I have a sword.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Quite.
No. But Pilate calling Jesus King of the Jews, right? So in Mark's gospel, you have Jesus introduced to Pilate with no introduction. It's just taken to Pilate, and Pilate immediately says, "So you're the one they call the King of the Jews." And I don't think there's a problem with that at all, because a crowd has called out, "Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David."
Right.
All of that's there in Mark, and it makes sense. But I don't think it makes sense to Luke, because Luke then has the priests whisper to Pilate, he's the one they call the King of the Jews. And then Pilate says, "So you're the one they call King of the Jews." He can resume copying from Mark, but he thinks that there's a problem there. Another is Jesus talks when he gets arrested about, they do kind of seem to cluster at this passion point. How frequently I've been teaching in the temple every day. And if you count it up in Matthew and Mark, you get 2 days that Jesus was teaching. Like, I've been in Jerusalem teaching daily in the temple. And so Luke will slip in a subtle thing like, on one of the days that Jesus was teaching in the temple, he said this. And he opens up this space for it to sound a little more accurate, that Jesus has probably done more teaching than has been recorded. So I just, again, I started with Greg Carey saying, when Luke reshuffles the deck in a huge way, there's usually a good reason for it. For starters, he needs to move the anointing story earlier, so that you can get introduce the women, because all of a sudden here's Jesus hanging on a cross, and the narrator just dropped in the fact that women had followed Jesus the entire time. And so Luke wants to introduce them way back then, so that you're not surprised by their presence at the end. It's again, when things come out of nowhere, Luke thinks they should not come out of nowhere. They should dutifully be foreshadowed or introduced.
Well, he does stress order, doesn't he? He does stress order, right? You know,
I think that's exactly what he means by an orderly account is a more narratively coherent account. Not this sort of, it's more chronologically accurate than the other historical Jesus stuff that I shy away from. I think that orderly means, when you look at rhetorical handbooks in antiquity, how to write a narrative, that sort of who, what, when, where, and why, he sees holes in his sources and thinks it only takes half a sentence or 3 sentences to make better sense or better order out of this.
Now, we should take that's loving the detail, and we'll come back to the detail, but we should take a step back and just make sure that the listeners, the viewers that are not familiar with either book, get an idea of what they're about. So let me just ask you about my book first. What's the fundamental thesis, and how do you see it as having been argued? I mean, what you know, this does sound a little bit like tell me about why I'm right.
you are correct, because I ultimately argue the same thing.
But yes, and I know that you agree, because your book actually came out before mine did anyway. But just taking a step back for a moment, my book, I suppose, is a bit more narrowly focused than yours is, to the extent that I think my book, it's fair to say, is really a book about John's gospel, even though it's got this funky title. Would that be fair?
Yes. And what you argue is that the Gospel of John, as we have it, is using Matthew, Mark, and Luke as sources. And I think you do many things exceptionally well. Two things I would highlight. One is that you are exactly right to say it's wrong for most scholars to assume that the consensus has been that John is independent of the Synoptics, because there really has always been not just a minor dissenting voice, but a loud chorus of dissenters. And so consensus is this murky issue, but we should really avoid that and say that that John didn't know the Synoptics at all. But if it's definitely not been 50-50. So it is, that's why there's a need for your book. But you do a good job of setting up, saying, now we are standing on the shoulders of those who came before us, and some not in the distant past, some fairly recently. The other thing you do is the hardest thing to do. It's what I did in my dissertation with just John and Matthew, but to say the absolute strictest test to see whether one gospel writer used another is to say, since we agree that Mark was the first written gospel, when we read John, do we find instances where John does the same thing that Matthew did to Mark? And we call that Matthean redaction. And when we read John, if we go back and we read Luke, do we find these cues where John is taking a cue from, not Q, the letter Q, the source we don't believe in, but a CUE cue from Luke to say, aha, I've read Mark. I see what you did to Mark. I like what you did, Luke. I'm going to steal that. And so very methodically, you make that case to say John has to know Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because John also has these things that are in Mark that are not in Matthew and Luke. And so what we have is a collection of these earlier gospels and John is working from them. And yes, of course, John writes a whole bunch of new scenes and gives us a whole bunch of new characters. But when you find places where there are commonalities, these are not the kinds of things that would just naturally arise through oral tradition. Or so. This is the kind of painstaking study of his source material, his multiple sources, without which he could not have written the gospel as he did.
Right. I mean, thank you for that. That's very helpful. I mean, to take the point, there's so many interesting things there, but to take one of the points, the point about consensus, I can't count how many times I read people saying that a consensus emerged in the latter half of the 20th century that John was independent of the Synoptics. I think it's complete nonsense. And it's really frustrating to me that sometimes in our scholarship, and I find myself doing it because you have to simplify and you have to find ways of telling a story, but we keep telling the same story, and the story often doesn't stand up to analysis. The idea that there was a consensus that John was independent of the Synoptics means you have to ignore scholars of the stature of Franz Neyrink, C.K. Barrett. I mean, it's nuts. And besides which, I think there's also a sexist element here as well, because, you know, you look at the scholarship of people like Wendy North or Margaret Davis that argue that John knew the Synoptics, and this stuff just gets ignored. So is the consensus just when men say it? You know, so I just wanted to pick up on that because I so agree with you on that point. But maybe I could pick up on something else and then push it back to you about your book. You mentioned there the alternative explanation to the one that we have, which is the kind of seas of oral tradition explanation. You know, that this idea that there's vast oceans of oral tradition, which all the evangelists could draw from. Neither of us is a big fan of the big sea of oral tradition, are we? Could you explain to me why you're, if it's fair to say you are, why you're a skeptic of the sea of oral tradition? Because your book is very much one that focuses on literary connections, right? It's literary connections that we're looking at here. And then no doubt someone will say to you something like, oh yes, but back in those days, the literacy levels were low, everyone talked to one another, we mustn't make literary borrowing our default, we need to... How do you respond to those sorts of things? I mean, why are you a skeptic of good old oral tradition?
For a couple of reasons. One is that it is, to me, even more hypothetical than Q, because I can reach on my bookshelf over here and pull off the critical edition of Q. There's been an attempt to reconstruct that. Oral tradition gets to be everywhere and everything all the time, with no real need to defend where and how it came from. All you have to do is it is, if you're a rook player, it is the rook card, or it is the wild card. It's just the trump card. Everything, it gets to be everything. Everything else in the deck, and I really don't think that's fair. I don't think either you or I think there was no such thing as oral tradition. I think that we get very nervous when people start to make very strong claims about this or that having derived from oral tradition, especially when that is then in the service of an argument to decouple two gospels that you and I see as coupled.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. I mean, in fact, one line from my book actually came from a lecture I was doing once. I don't know if this ever happens to you, but I'll be in the middle of a lecture and I'll say something and I think, oh, I like that, I'm going to use that again. So I was at, I can tell you I was at the SBL, the Society of Biblical Literature annual meeting, and I was giving a version of what later became chapter 1 of this book, of my book. And I just found myself saying, look, the problem with the appeal to oral tradition is not what it affirms, but what it denies. And the words were out of my lips, and I thought, oh, that's good. That the line's in the book. But what I meant by that was, it's not that people didn't talk to each other. Of course they did. We know they talked to one another. And we've got examples of oral tradition being reported in the Gospels. John 21 is about an oral tradition about the beloved disciple. Matthew 28 is about an oral tradition about Jesus's body. So we do have oral traditions reported. But my problem with them, it isn't affirming its probable existence and great variety and all the rest of it. It's using it as this like trump card, to use expression, get out of jail free card, to argue against what to me is the obvious, which is that when you've got close literary agreement, you've got one person copying off another person. Why default to oral tradition? So that's really where I worry about the issue. But yes, I affirm it must have been people talked,
Oh yes, and that's where I would when you say, well, how would you push back, especially with the low literacy rates?
Mm-hmm.
That's where I think it plays to our favor, and we should include Robin Walsh in this conversation.
Her name
I think her work is just brilliant on this topic, and I think what she thinks. I think that people who wrote books in antiquity, because so few people were capable of writing books, they wrote them for other writers. They wanted to impress other writers. Ironically enough, just this morning, Chris Keith, whom we both know, dropped into my intro New Testament class at Western Kentucky. And so we got to chat a little bit about this, and I had him give a bit of his ideas on Mark as a gospel. But the fact that so few people could write means that you would want to know what else was out there. Yeah. If you're writing a Jesus book, you've probably read a Jesus book. If you're Matthew, I even say in my book, I think Matthew, we have to imagine him first copying Mark by hand as a scribe, but not merely a scribe, clearly with his own compositional abilities. But in class today, I asked my students, I said, besides Dr. Keith and I, raise your hand if you've ever published a book. And it's a good class of undergraduates. So, of course, none of them have. I said, now, if you have in your lifetime read a book cover to cover, please raise your hand. And, of course, everyone raised their hands. And I have to say, this is how literacy is different. And I have a student, we have an affinity for the same film. And I quoted a line. I said, you like this film? You recognize this line? He said, of course. I said, have you ever read the screenplay written out of that film? He said, no. I said, you've just seen the movie, right?
Yeah.
And he said, yeah. I said, so you catch it that way. So I think that when you start talking about authorship in antiquity, that steers me farther and farther away from the stream or the creek or the river of oral tradition and more into what was published and circulating to say, I better know what's out there. If you're going to make another superhero movie, God help you getting a budget for that, right? But you at least better know what's out there, and you got to be able to sell a production company in 2 minutes on how yours is different. And I don't think that's unfair to say, first century authors of Gospels probably had to think that way.
Do you know, one of the things that I really enjoyed in your book is your use of the example, since you're talking about films here, of Pinocchio. And I don't know if I've mentioned this to you before, but the listeners certainly won't know this. I actually had to excise a section from my book on Pinocchio because I'd used the same analogy, but you did it so much better than I did. What I had written is that I was sitting, because I used to work at a Disney store, so for a year, just when I was finishing my doctorate and so on, and we used to have the films looping around all day, so I got to know them extremely well. And I got thinking one day there, if you'd seen the Disney Pinocchio, and then you picked up Collodi's original Pinocchio, which I then did and read.
Yes,
you could if it wasn't for the fact that the Disney film actually says in writing that this is based on the book by Collodi, you could easily assume that it was based on some oral tradition about this Pinocchio character.
Absolutely.
But it's not. It's inspired. I mean, but you point out as well that it's not just the Disney film, but it's later Pinocchio adaptations that also make what is just the talking cricket in Collodi's original. They make him into a real character, like in Disney's Jiminy Cricket, and he's Pinocchio's conscience and that. If I remember rightly, the reason why he's Pinocchio's conscience is because in the original, Pinocchio whacks the talking cricket and kills it.
Right.
So, which doesn't happen to Jiminy. So yeah, I kind of love the way you do it. Let me just make a general point and a specific one about that. The general point is that one of the things I like about your book is you are not afraid to use both good, sophisticated, classical analogies and some pop culture, so we can get a bit of Pinocchio in there, or Mad Men, or whatever else. Sopranos. Is Sopranos in there somewhere?
No, the Beatles
is Mad Men. Beatles are in there, of course. Excellent. So that's the general point that I actually encourage my students to use pop culture when they're trying to think things through. Sometimes as in contrast, but I wanted to just sort of ask you on the specifics of this. One of the things that people, let's not shy away from this point. Some people will say that John is so different from the Synoptics that it's really difficult to imagine him using them. Luke is so different from Matthew, say, in the way he structures things, that he can't have used it. And so you do get these arguments. This B is so different from A, therefore B can't have known A. What do you make of that in the light of things like your analogy from Pinocchio and other things?
I like the modern ones because I think they do show how different they can be. Guillermo del Toro's, who's Italian. He recast Pinocchio. Pinocchio, of course, being written before the First World War, but del Toro's is after fascism and Mussolini, and it's very much a political critique of that. But then you say, how different is that really if we think the spirit versus the letter, right? So I think there's a way to say, you can see some of what you do with John transforming the Synoptics to say that can be very creative. I talk about rewriting, and you talk about dramatic transformation. So I think a big part of it is simply granting authors artistic license. But you also mentioned structure, and I love those arguments because I think they're so easy to shoot down. Because I wrote another book about Tatian's Diatessaron, and we have a harmony of the four Gospels, all Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, woven together intricately. Sometimes, not block by block as people often think. Sometimes half a sentence from one gospel, half a sentence from another gospel. And the other thing we see, this is written by Tatian. This is roughly 100 years after the Gospels are out. And he'll take a scene where it's only in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they proceed in lockstep from one event to another. And he'll grab a piece from elsewhere in Luke and shove it into the middle. There was Tatian, my friend. There was no easier ready-made harmonization for you. Why did you go and grab this and put it there? But then again, we're back to what Greg Carey showed us years ago. Of Luke does this. The foot washing, right? I mean, the anointing. It's so it's not hard at all to say there's absolute literary dependence, and there can be a pretty radical relocation. And I always use a deck of cards as the analogy. I just say, you probably want your birth story near the beginning, so let's pull out a few cards. You need that crucifixion, resurrection at the end. Let's pull out 7 or 8 cards there. Here's the rest of the deck. It's every story in the Gospels. And then sometimes I'll even demonstratively bring a deck of cards and shuffle it and say, does it matter where we put these parables? Does it matter where we put these healings? But if we relocate them, it's not changing the story, and it's in no way saying, I heard this independently. It's just saying I chose to put it elsewhere.
But you and I both know that the objection here, and for us too, as people that believe in the Pharaoh theory that Luke used Matthew, we know that people will come along and say, yeah, but it's all very well saying Luke could have done this if he wanted to, and people make fun of me because I think that Luke is this great literary artist, and I can answer everything by saying, well, look, actually I think I think that is the answer. I think Luke is
Yes.
great what he does most of the time. I mean, there's a reason why he has the parable of the rich fool before the stuff on consider the lilies, which is pulled from Matthew 6, because it pairs with it beautifully. But anyway, that's to one side. You and I both know that our critics will say, but it was physically so difficult. And I'm teeing this up, right? It's physically too difficult to do what Luke must have done with Matthew, because it would have involved scrolling one way, scrolling the other way, and all the rest of it. And I'm deliberately teeing this up because one of the things I really love about your book, and I mentioned this in the foreword, is that unlike me, and unlike most New Testament scholars, you are actually a practical person. You aren't satisfied with just saying that things are plausible or this might have happened and that might have happened. You actually make them happen. Now, can you, even though I'm supposed to be talking, at least I am talking about your book, but I want you to tell the listeners and the viewers about how you use practical wisdom to try and explain what the evangelists were doing.
Yes. Well, first you have to get your power tools out if you're going to do good New Testament scholarship. And for
who knew?
viewers,
I mean, honestly, who knew? When I was in grad school, we thought when I was in grad school, we used to joke that we weren't practical people. It was all up here in our heads. So love it. Show us.
No, yeah, you get your boards and you get out the router. You chisel one by hand to earn your stripes, and then you use the router, and then you experiment with some wax recipes, and you make a waxed tablet, and then you show, okay, here's a legal sheet that I used to write on. Here's a wax tablet. Those are about the same size.
Pretty similar.
We have, because we have tablets, the wax is so thin, and people use metal to write with. We have some where the wax has gone away, and they've scrawled through so we can read a letter that someone wrote because they scratched. So we know that the handwriting's about the same. You can get to 400 characters on a board. And if you've got one that's opens up double on one page, okay, that's 800 characters, roughly average of five letters per word. We're talking like a double spaced sheet of paper here,
right,
to have a simple triptych to write in a wax tablet. That's not hard. And how laborious is it to scroll? I mean, if something is 5 columns away, oh God, help me! How could I ever? Oh wait, it's only 12 inches. That's how far 5 columns away is. And it takes so long to scroll from one into another. So I made a scroll of the Gospel of John. It took a lot of time and a lot of contact cement and a lot of hunched over. And I really needed that workstation to be higher in hindsight. But I can scroll from one end of the Gospel of John to the other in 5 minutes and then scroll in reverse. And I am hardly someone who's been trained from the time of my earliest education in reading from a scroll. It's not hard at all to relocate there, especially if you're using it as a source. When you read aloud, you need to hold it tightly. When you need to copy from it, who cares if you unroll it 10 feet? You're going to roll it up later. And then you just fold it over, and there it is, and you copy from it. None of that is mechanically or technically difficult. And I've done everything I could since you and I first met. When I first started going down this road over a decade ago, I have never come out of that rabbit hole. I pop my head up once in a while to update my findings. And every time it gets easier and easier to demonstrate how these things were done in antiquity. And it's impractical scholars who have built up the idea that it would be so laborious or so taxing or unimaginable.
No, it's very helpful. It really is. I mean, one of the things that has always struck me in the question of Luke working with Matthew is that there is one occasion in Luke's gospel where Jesus is depicted as finding a place in a scroll in Luke chapter 4:16-30, the rejection at Nazareth. And he is working with Isaiah, which is one of the longest books in the Hebrew Bible.
Absolutely.
And he reads from Isaiah 61. Now, you and I probably think that story is Luke's creative rewriting of Mark 6's rejection at Nazareth, which doesn't have this big scroll in it. But you can go and look at the Great Isaiah scroll from Qumran, and it's pretty long, and Luke has no problem at all in thinking it would be plausible to say that Jesus found the place where it says, "The Spirit of the Lord has anointed me." So I love you actually demonstrating something.
You can
that
do it
seemed to be
because
the case.
you can scan as you read, and there are funny things that pop out to you. Especially if you know the Gospel of John. I mean, if you see a word like skinophagia, and then there are place names and individuals' names that it's kind of like when you do one of those word search puzzles, and a few of the words just jump out at you. I found this actually when I was working on manuscripts that are descended from Tatian's Diatessaron. For whatever reason, Tyre and Sidon, just because it's only a couple of places that you even see that, it became this locus for me. And in that case, I was working with the codex where I had to know how many pages, but I could orient myself and I could scan. And in some cases, I was working with a facsimile where I actually had to physically move across and down a row. And I've started to find my way around this incredibly long text.
And as William Johnson says, people were using book rolls for centuries. They didn't go around complaining about it. I mean, a lot of it is just anachronistic anxiety. It's us trying to imagine ourselves into the position of the ancients, and then getting anxious about it, and then projecting our anxiety onto the writing of, say, Luke's Gospel. I have a problem with that.
I always come back to and say we need to draw an important distinction between difficult and time consuming.
Right.
Because to say that I would draft on a waxed tablet, absolutely 100 to 1. That's the speed, typing at the speed of thought, deleting, rearranging, cutting and pasting, the kinds of things that we know how to do on a word processor that we couldn't do when I was in high school, by the way, which very recent. But because we can sort of edit at that speed of thought, we think of something being laborious because it took more time. And I always try to say, just because it took more time doesn't mean it was more difficult, right? Now, you can only write so long by hand before your hand gets tired. I grant that. But if you're a professional scribe, then you're able to write quite a bit more than I ever could. So that's, again, the anachronism is ironically on the modern side of things. Being projected back.
Absolutely. And one of the things I love about technology is the way that things come back again. So we've used the word tablet here, right? Talking about wax tablets.
Yes.
But we all have tablets. So a tablet's sitting here on my desk, right? We call it a tablet. We even call it that. A little, pen, just like, and then,
And how do you maneuver it, though? You scroll.
You scroll.
So
you're
scrolling on a tablet.
Scrolling's come back as well.
An ancient person would say you can't do both. No, which is it that you're scrolling? Your tablet.
Yeah.
But I know what you mean. Like, it absolutely comes full circle.
These things come back, and they help us think, seriously about. I mean, I think we have to engage our imaginations when we're doing this work. I think that's very helpful. Can I at least mention, because we don't have as much time as I'd like, I'd love to mention one more thing that I think we have flipped back around the other way around now. So I actually am asking about your book, but the conceit worked for a while. Now, I really like one aspect of your book, and I want to ask you about it. Oppositio oh my goodness, am I going to get the Latin phrase wrong?
Oppositio in imitando.
In imitando, thank you. Which I think you say in the book something like, this is one of the only times you're going to use a pretentious phrase in the whole book.
The only pretentious Latin phrase I'll use throughout the book.
Excellent. So I like the self-deprecating humor, and but can you explain what that principle is? Because I found this really helpful. I was already familiar with it because of your earlier book on John's use of Matthew. And I think your explanation of like in Matthew 10, we've got go nowhere among the Samaritans. And then one of the very first thing that happens in John's gospel is Jesus goes to Samaria. So that's kind of fun. But explain to us what this feature is, this oppositio in imitandum.
I owe the phrase that one of my dissertation committee members was a classicist, and he was reading what I had written, and in the defense, he said, "We call this oppositio in imitando." And AJ Levine.
See, that's a great advert right there for interdisciplinarity. Talk to your colleagues when classical studies.
Exactly. We don't talk together enough. I actually wrote to William Johnson, you mentioned earlier at one point, when I was doing the work on the Argonautica, and what we have from that in Egypt. But AJ Levine was my doctoral mutter, and she said, "That's good. Write that down. When you revise this for publication, work that in." And essentially what it is to oppose something in the very act of imitating it, and not oppose it in an adversarial way. But what I mean by it is to take a story and to turn it inside out. So like you said, Matthew's Jesus says, don't go anywhere among the Samaritans. Mark's gospel says nothing about Samaria or Samaritans at all.
Right.
Luke's gospel comes along, and the disciples at least try to go to one Samaritan village, and they can't. So it's sort of Luke rewriting Matthew to say, well, Jesus didn't reject the Samaritans. It was the Samaritans who rejected Jesus. And John is saying, no, Jesus didn't reject the Samaritans, and the Samaritans didn't reject Jesus. Jesus went to the Samaritans. They recognized him as the savior of the world. And so I think it makes the most sense if John knows exactly what his predecessors have done, and he wants to turn that inside out. The same thing with the paralysis healing. We know so well. It's on the synopsis that I use, that I made myself, that I use every semester in Intro New Testament class. It's that story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's up in the Galilee. It's the man has these friends who can carry him, and but he's unable to walk. And Jesus sees the faith of the friends, and it occasions this whole debate about forgiveness of sins, because Jesus first forgives the man's sins, and then, to prove that he has the authority to forgive sins, tells the paralyzed man to walk. In John's gospel, they're in Jerusalem. The man has no friends. No one can take him to the pool. And Jesus says, get up and walk. And this is where I borrow from you with fatigue, because you don't know what's wrong with the guy. All we know is it's where all the sick people were. And come to find out, the man is physically unable to get up and walk until Jesus performs the miracle. And then Jesus says, and don't sin again. Or don't do it. Don't watch out that you don't sin, so that nothing worse happens. Who said anything about sin? He's presupposing the synoptic narrative. But you could look at that and say, oh, Galilee, Jerusalem, friends, no friends. All they have in common is paralysis healing. And I look at that and say, that is John's literary creativity. And I do think there's a burden of proof. But how do you get all of these elements in one place in John if John doesn't know at all what's been going on in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? And as you talk about in your own book, using peripateo as a verb to walk, get up and walk around. There are too many similarities that, to me, I think John has really said, how can I turn this inside out and see what I did there?
And there is a pretty close verbatim agreement there in the get up, pick up your mat and walk. Absolutely. I suppose where our critics are going to come in, they'll say, so are you seriously saying that where John is saying the exact opposite thing to the synoptics, that proves that he knows them? Maybe we're the ones that have got things inside out. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I anticipate that as an objection, and I say in the conclusion, I know that sounds a little bit like heads I win, tails you lose, because it's just creative rewriting the more different it is. But I do go back, if you think about something like Richard Hayes in the Echoes of Scripture, density was one of his big principles, right? it can't just be one random thing that they have in common. You need to find a density or a cluster of elements
Clusters
that
of
are all
stuff.
there.
Yeah.
And that's, for me, when I see the paralysis healing in John, I still see that cluster of opposites.
Yeah.
To where, okay, changing the setting and leaving the poor guy friendless, forgetting to introduce that he was paralyzed, not having any setup for the for forgiveness. I think there are enough synoptic elements clustered in one place, as you say, and then throw in some verbatim agreements that you really do see that as the way things work. And it's why I did a lot of work early on to say, hey, we can look at Josephus reading Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, and yet writing a different version of the same story. That kind of rewriting, there's no doubt that Josephus has both of those stories of the kings of Israel and Judah at his disposal, and in Hebrew and in Greek, and even knows the differences between the Hebrew and Greek at times. So we see Josephus doing it, and when he goes his own way and he writes a new version of the story, well, that's what he's doing. And it just so happens that he's writing at almost exactly the same time that our Gospels are being written. I don't think these things are a stretch as far as compositional practices go.
Yeah, he's such a helpful analog to our gospel writers, isn't he? Yeah, very much so. So since this is my show, I can ask, I suppose, the last couple of questions. I really enjoyed your rewriting the Synoptics, writing and rewriting the Gospels, John and the Synoptics, and obviously links in the show notes to where to purchase these. I think our books, they look quite similar. I guess you would actually be able to, you would actually notice that that it has the same designer. Anyway, the thing that I wanted to ask you last of all is, what's next? Now that you've solved the problem of Tatian's diatessaron and have written a really accessible, engaging book about the Synoptic Gospels and John, where are your interests moving next? Is it more of the same, or is it a different project? What are we thinking about next?
For the moment, it is enjoying a break after revising the dissertation too. That's 3 books going back in 11 years, and so all the articles and essays that accompany that along the way. But if I have another book in me, it'll be back to where everything began with me, with Dave Dungan as an undergrad and its canonization. And I won't tip my hand here other than to say, you might be thinking the last thing we need is another book on canonization of the New Testament. But I will say, since I don't have to explain myself, I think pretty much every book on canonization has gone about the question completely wrong. And so I would take a completely different approach to how we got what we got, which I think is the problem, not the answer.
Excellent. Well, that sounds fascinating. I hope you get the chance to do that. I have every sympathy with what you said, though. If given that you've produced 3 books in 11 years, do you know how many I've produced in the same time period? Just the one.
Well, but if we're keeping score, you have published far more than I. And I could not. Your listeners need to know, I could not have done this book without your help. And Larry Hurtado, who has since passed away, the two of you vouched for my book with Eerdmans when no one knew who I was. And I am immensely grateful for that. It shows just the kind of gracious scholars both of you
that's very kind of you. The little bit of truth in the Eerdmans tale is that when I received the proposal for your book to have a look at, my heart skipped a beat because it was the book I was trying to write. And so the first thing I said at the time was, well, this looks really great, and I think it's going to do a really great job, but I'm writing a book on the same topic. And this has a habit of happening to me, because when I was writing my book on Thomas and the Synoptics, I heard that Simon Gathercole, that we mentioned earlier, was writing a similar book, and my heart skipped a beat then. And in fact, it was Simon's producing his book, finishing his manuscript well before I did, that gave me a real big kick up the backside for me to get on and finish mine. Actually, in the end, yours morphed a little bit into more of a kind of a Gospels book than a purely John and the Synoptics book, even though John and the Synoptics is pretty much central to the thesis. But my heart did skip a beat, because I thought, oh gosh, is this happening? Is this happening to me again? But actually, it did help me as well on this occasion also, to have a bit of a kick at the backside to get the thing finished, because I don't write quickly. I find writing difficult, and so I could always prefer to do something else.
It's also interesting because I think at the time when we talked about that 11 years ago, and I at least had proposed the book very much more like your book, of John's knowledge of Mark and composition, Matthean redaction, Lucan redaction, because that's what I had done in my dissertation. And I think, as you described what you were looking at, I at least my terminology would be almost more impressionistic, more of, and I think somewhere in the past 11 years, like ships we crossed in the night, and I ended up writing a much more general, and then you have the very meticulous knowledge, John's knowledge of all this redaction that ended up not really being so much a feature of my book as I'd originally intended, because I went different roads. But even when you had the advantage point of both of them, you said our two books are so complementary, and we even both ended up with Christology chapters. I don't think either of us thought a decade ago we would be writing about Christology, but they're completely different Christology chapters. Totally. And I think everyone would do well to say, these are, if we read these both together, they really do make a tight narrative of how we got the Gospels. And I'll be interested to see the extent to which, when we started by talking with consensus.
Yeah.
Do we have a new consensus form?
Well, I tell you what, one other fun thing that comes out of that, and that's that there are a lot of people who talk about the kind of stuff that we do in these books, like source criticism, the kind of stuff that you would roll your eyes at. And one of the reasons for that is it's commonly perceived that if you do work on this gospel, knowing this gospel, and literary connections and all the rest of it, that you're interested in the kind of minutiae, minor agreements, verbatim agreements, this sort of thing, and you don't look at the much more interesting pictures, like who's Jesus? And I think I've always hated that narrative. I'll be honest. It sounds like people complaining about having too much work to do.
Yep.
But that to one side. That to one side. I think the fact we both end up with chapters on Christology shows the importance of doing this work, because this kind of work then helps you to understand trajectories in Christology, for example. Yes. Oh, I said trajectories. I wasn't going to do that.
I agree.
We've been talking for almost an hour, and it's been, as always is with you, James, an absolute pleasure. I'm very happy, though, that on this occasion, we've got to share our conversation with a few more people, and I hope that viewers and listeners have enjoyed it. But thank you so much for coming on the podcast, James. Really appreciate it.
It is an honor. The NT Pod, if I had a bucket list, it would be on it. So many thanks for the invitation.
You're absolutely welcome. Thanks so much. Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. A reminder that you can find James Barker's book by going to look for Writing and Rewriting the Gospels. It's published by Eerdmans, but it's available from all good booksellers and some not very good booksellers too. And my own book, The Fourth Synoptic Gospel, you can find that in all the usual places. I'll have links in the show notes. Thanks again for watching. Be along again soon. Bye-bye.